Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. World War II is often remembered through the lens of major battles, famous generals, and decisive moments that turned the tide of war. We've all heard about D-Day, Pearl Harbor, and the Battle of the Bulge, epic clashes that shaped the course of history. But beyond these well-known events lies a vast and largely forgotten world of personal stories, overlooked sacrifices, and hidden struggles that shaped the lives of countless American soldiers. These are the stories that history books often leave out, the stories of men and women who fought, suffered, and endured in ways that rarely make it into mainstream narratives. When we think about World War II, we tend to focus on the grand strategy and key victories, but for the average soldier, the war was an entirely different experience. It wasn't just about storming beaches or facing off against enemy forces in dramatic battles. It was about surviving in the trenches of Europe, navigating the dense jungles of the Pacific, and enduring the bitter cold of remote battlefronts. For many, the war was a daily grind of exhaustion, hunger, and fear, far from the glorified images often seen in movies and textbooks. Some of the most harrowing experiences came not from the battlefield itself, but from the brutal conditions soldiers faced. In the Pacific, American troops fought against more than just Japanese forces. They also had to contend with tropical diseases like malaria, dengue fever, and dysentery. Many units were stranded in the jungle for weeks, their bodies deteriorating due to malnutrition and infection. The psychological toll was immense, with soldiers constantly on edge, never knowing when an enemy sniper or ambush might strike. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, American airmen flying bombing missions over Germany faced nightmarish odds. The life expectancy of a bomber crewman was shockingly low, with flak cannons and enemy fighter planes tearing through formations of B-17s and B-24s. Those who survived crashes or were forced to bail out often found themselves behind enemy lines, either trying to evade capture or becoming prisoners of war, where they faced months, even years of starvation, forced labor, and brutal treatment in Nazi prison camps. Then there were the stories of extraordinary heroism that history barely acknowledges. Take the case of Dory Miller, a black sailor who had never been trained for combat but found himself in the middle of the attack on Pearl Harbor. He manned an anti-aircraft gun and fought back against the Japanese assault, even though he had never been allowed to use such a weapon before. Despite his bravery, his story was overshadowed for years. Or the story of the Ghost Army, a unit of artists, designers, and engineers who used deception, inflatable tanks, and sound effects to trick German forces, saving thousands of American lives while remaining virtually unknown to the public. The sacrifices made by these soldiers extended beyond the battlefield. When the war ended, many returned home, not to parades and celebrations, but to a country that had moved on without them. PTSD, then known as battle fatigue or shell shock, was poorly understood, leaving thousands to struggle in silence. The horrors they had witnessed, the loss of friends, the near-death experiences, the moral dilemmas of war, stayed with them forever. Some veterans, like the members of the all-Japanese American 442nd Regimental Combat Team, returned to a nation that still viewed them with suspicion, despite their incredible bravery and sacrifice on the front lines. World War II was more than just a series of famous battles. It was a deeply personal and often devastating experience for those who lived through it. Their struggles, sacrifices, and acts of courage deserve to be remembered, even if they didn't make it into the history books. These are the untold stories of World War II, the hidden side of history that shaped the lives of those who fought, and ultimately, shaped the world we live in today. For the soldiers who fought in World War II, the reality of war was far from the glorified images often depicted in movies and textbooks. It was a relentless test of endurance, both physically and mentally. The battlefield wasn't just about bullets and bombs. It was about surviving grueling conditions, unbearable weather, and the constant weight of fear and exhaustion. The harsh conditions American soldiers faced during World War II were among the most physically and mentally grueling aspects of the conflict. From the bitter cold of Europe to the suffocating heat of the Pacific, soldiers endured extreme weather that could be just as deadly as the enemy. The bitter cold of the Ardennes, one of the most infamous examples of extreme cold during the war, was the Battle of the Bulge, December 1944, January 1945. American troops, many of whom were young and inexperienced, were stationed in the dense Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. When the Germans launched their surprise offensive, temperatures plummeted to below freezing, sometimes reaching as low as 20 degrees Celsius, 29 degrees Celsius. The lack of proper winter clothing made the situation even worse. Many soldiers had not been issued heavy coats, gloves, or insulated boots, leaving them vulnerable to frostbite. The bitter cold caused severe health problems, with frostbite claiming fingers, toes, ears, and sometimes entire limbs. In extreme cases, frostbite led to gangrene, requiring amputations. Soldiers who tried to warm their hands over fires risked their fingers breaking open due to the sudden expansion of frozen tissue. Another serious condition was trench foot, caused by prolonged exposure to cold, damp conditions. Soldiers' feet would remain wet for days, swelling, blistering, and eventually developing severe infections. If untreated, the flesh would blacken and rot, leading to amputation. The only way to prevent it was to keep feet dry, which was nearly impossible when marching through snow, ice, and frozen mud. The cold also affected weapons and equipment. Grease inside rifle barrels and machine guns froze solid, making them unusable in combat. Soldiers had to scrape off excess grease and rely on body heat to warm up their weapons before firing. Vehicles, including tanks and trucks, struggled to start in freezing temperatures, leaving troops stranded or vulnerable to attack. The scorching heat of the Pacific and North Africa. In stark contrast, soldiers fighting in the Pacific Theater and North Africa endured extreme heat and suffocating humidity. In the Pacific Islands, such as Guadalcanal, Iwo and the Philippines, temperatures soared above 100 degrees Celsius, 38 degrees Celsius, with oppressive humidity. Soldiers carried heavy packs, rifles, and ammunition through dense jungles, where the air was thick and unrelenting. Sweat soaked their uniforms, and dehydration was a constant risk. The jungle environment brought additional challenges: heat exhaustion and heat stroke. Soldiers often collapsed from overheating, especially when forced to march long distances without enough water. Tropical diseases, malaria, dengue fever, and dysentery were rampant. Swarms of mosquitoes infected soldiers with deadly diseases, and the constant presence of flies and unsanitary conditions led to stomach illnesses, rotting wounds, and infections. In the damp, humid climate, even minor cuts could quickly become infected. Soldiers who suffered wounds in battle were at high risk of developing gangrene due to the lack of proper medical supplies and sterile conditions. In North Africa, American troops faced a different but equally punishing type of heat. The desert was scorching during the day, reaching over 120 degrees, 49 degrees Celsius, while at night temperatures dropped drastically, sometimes near freezing. Soldiers fighting in places like Tunisia struggled to find enough water, and their rations would spoil quickly in the intense heat. The combination of sunburn, dehydration, and heat stroke made survival as much of a challenge as fighting the enemy. Survival and adaptation. Despite these brutal conditions, American troops adapted and found ways to survive. In cold environments, they learned to layer their clothing, rub their hands and feet to keep circulation going, and dry their boots whenever possible. In hot climates, they drank as much water as they could find, covered their skin to prevent sunburn, and relied on medical advancements such as quinine for malaria. Conclusion. The extreme conditions of World War II added another layer of suffering to an already brutal war. Whether freezing in Europe or sweltering in the Pacific, American soldiers had to battle not just the enemy, but also nature itself. Many of those who survived carried the physical and psychological scars of these conditions for the rest of their lives. On the other side of the world, in the Pacific, American troops endured the exact opposite: blazing heat, suffocating humidity, and an unforgiving jungle environment. The air was thick with mosquitoes that carried malaria, and many soldiers were constantly sick with fever and infections. The jungle was a living nightmare. Leeches clung to their skin, snakes slithered through their sleeping areas, and torrential rains turned everything into a mud-covered swamp. In some battles, soldiers were forced to wade through waist-deep swamps where the water was filled with parasites, and every step risked an encounter with hidden enemy snipers. Sleep was nearly impossible. Between the unbearable heat, insect bites, and the fear of sudden ambushes, soldiers were often operating on the brink of total exhaustion. The emotional toll. Fear, fatigue, and psychological scars beyond the physical hardships, World War II took a massive toll on the minds of those who fought. Soldiers lived in a constant state of anxiety. Every moment on the battlefield was a gamble. One wrong step, one sudden explosion, and it could all be over. The sound of gunfire and artillery became a permanent part of their existence, and for many that sound never truly faded, even after the war ended. The psychological stress of combat was so overwhelming that many soldiers began to suffer from what was then called shell shock, now known as PTSD. The signs were everywhere. Men trembling uncontrollably, staring blankly into space, or breaking down in tears after surviving yet another brutal encounter. Some soldiers would completely shut down, unable to move or respond, their minds trapped in an endless cycle of fear and trauma. Others developed severe paranoia, jumping at the slightest noise or refusing to sleep for fear of being attacked. 2. Soldiers developed their own ways to manage the unbearable stress. Some turned to humor, cracking jokes and pulling pranks to lighten the mood, even in the middle of combat. Others relied on letters from home. Every envelope carried a piece of normalcy, a reminder that there was still a world beyond the horrors of war. Many turned to superstition, carrying lucky charms, religious tokens, or small personal items they believed would protect them. Alcohol and cigarettes became crutches, helping soldiers numb their emotions, even if only temporarily. Yet for many, the worst part came after the war. PTSD wasn't understood at the time, and soldiers returning home were expected to simply move on. But the memories of battle didn't fade so easily. Many veterans suffered from nightmares, flashbacks, and overwhelming guilt. Some struggled with alcohol addiction or isolated themselves from their families. The horrors of what they had seen, the friends they had lost, the acts of violence they had committed, stayed with them forever. The reality of a World War II soldier's experience was not just about fighting battles. It was about surviving, an unforgiving world of extreme conditions, relentless stress, and the lasting scars that war left on their bodies and minds. These were not just warriors. They were human beings pushed to their absolute limits, facing challenges that most people could never imagine. And for many, even after the war ended, the battle within never truly stopped. The Ghost Army, the masters of deception. One of the most extraordinary yet little-known units of World War II was the Ghost Army, an elite group of artists, designers, and engineers who played a crucial role in deceiving the German military. Officially known as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, this top-secret unit was tasked with creating elaborate battlefield illusions, fake armies, fake movements, and even fake sounds to mislead the enemy and save American lives. Imagine this, an entire division of soldiers, complete with tanks, artillery, and radio operators, except none of it was real. The Ghost Army used inflatable tanks, rubber aircraft, and carefully staged troop movements to convince the Germans that thousands of soldiers were preparing for an attack, when in reality the real forces were moving elsewhere. They even broadcast fake radio transmissions, mimicking the communication patterns of actual military units. To make the deception even more convincing, they played pre-recorded battle sounds through massive loudspeakers, creating the illusion of tanks rolling in, troops assembling, and artillery preparing to fire. Their work was so effective that in some cases, the Germans repositioned entire divisions to counter what they believed was a major offensive, only to realize too late that they had been tricked. One of their greatest successes came in Operation Viersen, just before the Allies crossed the Rhine River in 1945. By making it appear as if a massive force was gathering miles away from the actual crossing point, they successfully diverted German troops, allowing the real attack to take place with much less resistance. The Ghost Army was so secret that even after the war, their contributions were largely classified. It wasn't until decades later that their efforts were fully recognized, proving that sometimes the art of deception can be just as powerful as brute force on the battlefield. The Lost Battalion of the 36th Infantry Division, a desperate fight for survival. October 1944, deep in the dense forests of eastern France, nearly 300 American soldiers from the 141st Infantry Regiment, part of the 36th Infantry Division, found themselves cut off from the rest of their unit, surrounded by thousands of German troops. Known as the Lost Battalion, these men had advanced too far into enemy territory and suddenly realized they were completely trapped. With no supplies, no reinforcements, and little chance of escape, their only option was to dig in and fight. For nearly a week, these soldiers endured relentless attacks. The Germans bombarded their position with artillery, mortars, and machine gun fire, hoping to force a surrender. Food and water ran out, medical supplies were scarce, and wounded soldiers were forced to lie in agony with no treatment. The weather was brutal, cold, wet, and unforgiving, making the already desperate conditions even worse. Despite this, the men refused to give up. Back at Allied headquarters, attempts to break through enemy lines and rescue them were failing, until one of the most remarkable rescue missions of the war took place. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, an all-Japanese-American unit, was called in to save the Lost Battalion. These soldiers, many of whom had family members locked away in U.S. internment camps, fought with incredible determination. They battled through thick forests, uphill terrain, and relentless enemy fire, suffering heavy casualties along the way. But after 5 grueling days, they finally broke through and reached the trapped battalion. The cost of the rescue was immense. The 442nd lost over 800 men to save fewer than 300. But their bravery cemented their place in history as one of the most highly decorated units of World War II, proving that despite the discrimination they faced at home, their loyalty and courage were undeniable. African American and Native American soldiers, fighting 2 battles. While America was fighting for freedom abroad, many of its own soldiers were still battling discrimination at home. Despite facing racism in their own country, African American and Native American soldiers made enormous contributions to the war effort. One of the most famous groups was the Tuskegee Airmen, an elite group of black fighter pilots who shattered racial stereotypes and proved themselves as some of the most skilled aviators of the war. Facing constant discrimination, even from their fellow soldiers, they had to fight just to be allowed to fly in combat. But once they were given the chance, they exceeded all expectations. Flying missions over Europe, they provided escort protection for American bombers, ensuring they reached their targets safely. Their record was so impressive that bomber crews began requesting the Tuskegee Airmen to escort them, knowing they had a better chance of making it back alive. Meanwhile, Native American soldiers played a crucial but often overlooked role. The Navajo code talkers were one of the most vital assets in the Pacific Theater. The U.S. military needed a secure way to communicate, and the Navajo language provided an unbreakable code. The Japanese, who had cracked every previous American code, were completely baffled by the complex and unwritten Navajo dialect. This allowed American forces to send messages instantly without fear of enemy interception. These code talkers played a decisive role in major battles like Iwo Jima, ensuring that commands and coordinates could be relayed without risk. But for both groups, the fight didn't end when they returned home. Despite their heroism, many Black Sea and Native American veterans faced continued discrimination. The GI Bill, which helped white veterans buy homes and go to college, was often denied to African American soldiers due to segregationist policies. Native American veterans returned to reservations that still lacked basic rights and resources. Their sacrifices were enormous, but the recognition they deserved was slow to come. Jewish American soldiers, fighting against the Holocaust. For many Jewish American soldiers, the war was deeply personal. While they were fighting the Nazis on the battlefield, their own families were suffering under Hitler's reign of terror. Some soldiers had parents, grandparents, or distant relatives trapped in Nazi-occupied Europe. They weren't just fighting for their country, they were fighting for their own people's survival. One of the most haunting experiences for these soldiers came in the final months of the war, as they began liberating concentration camps. Many had heard rumors of the atrocities, but nothing could prepare them for what they witnessed. When American troops reached Buchenwald, Dachau, and Mauthausen, they found thousands of emaciated prisoners, barely alive, staring at them with hollow eyes. The sight of mass graves, gas chambers, and piles of human remains left even the toughest soldiers in shock. For Jewish American soldiers, The realization that they had just saved fellow Jews, some of whom had lost entire families in the camps, was both heartbreaking and deeply meaningful. Some even discovered distant relatives among the survivors. Others were haunted by the thought that if their ancestors had never immigrated to the U.S., they too might have been among the victims. Many Jewish American soldiers took their mission a step further by helping survivors rebuild their lives. Some stayed behind after the war to assist in refugee camps, while others worked to bring Holocaust survivors to America. Their fight didn't end with military victory. It continued in their efforts to ensure that those who suffered under Nazi rule found safety and a future. The hidden heroes of World War II. These stories, of deception and ingenuity, of resilience, in the face of overwhelming odds, of fighting two battles at once, and of deeply personal stakes, reveal a side of World War II that history books often overlook. Beyond the famous battles and well-known leaders, there were thousands of individual acts of heroism that shaped the course of the war. These soldiers, whether tricking the enemy with inflatable tanks, standing their ground against impossible odds, or proving their worth in a segregated military, played a crucial role in the fight for victory. Their sacrifices and contributions may not always be in the spotlight, but they are no less significant. These are the untold stories of World War II, the ones that deserve to be remembered, honored, and shared for generations to come. For many American soldiers, being captured by the enemy was only the beginning of an even greater nightmare. The experience of being a prisoner of war, POW, in World War II varied depending on where they were held: German POW camps in Europe or Japanese camps in the Pacific. But in both cases, prisoners faced brutal conditions, forced labor, starvation, and in some instances, unimaginable cruelty. American soldiers in German POW camps, harsh conditions and escape attempts. Thousands of American soldiers, particularly bomber crews shot down over enemy territory, found themselves behind barbed wire. In German stalags, prisoner of war camps scattered throughout Nazi-occupied Europe. While German camps followed some of the Geneva Conventions, at least for American and British prisoners, life in these camps was far from humane. Prisoners were crammed into overcrowded barracks with little food and almost no medical care. Many suffered from frostbite in the brutal winters or became sick from malnutrition. One of the biggest dangers for POWs in Germany came as the war neared its end. With the Allies closing in, Hitler ordered the forced evacuation of many POW camps, sending thousands of prisoners on brutal death marches across Germany in freezing conditions. Some prisoners, too weak to walk, were shot by their captors. But not all POWs simply accepted their fate. Many made daring escape attempts. One of the most famous POW camps was Stalag Luft III, the site of the real-life Great Escape. Made famous by the 1963 movie, The Great Escape involved Allied airmen digging a massive underground tunnel right under the noses of their German captors. Using bed slats as support beams, tin cans for ventilation, and even stolen German uniforms for disguises, they spent months planning their escape. When the night finally came, 76 prisoners crawled through the tunnel and escaped into the German countryside. Unfortunately, most were recaptured, and 50 were executed on Hitler's direct orders. But their bravery and ingenuity remain legendary. Japanese POW camps, unimaginable brutality, and the Bataan Death March. While German POW camps were harsh, Japanese POW camps were a living hell. Unlike the Germans, the Japanese military did not recognize the Geneva Conventions, viewing surrender as dishonorable. As a result, American and Allied prisoners captured in the Pacific were subjected to horrific conditions, forced labor, starvation, and brutal executions. Perhaps the most infamous example of this cruelty was the Bataan Death March. In April 1942, after months of fighting in the Philippines, about 75,000 American and Filipino soldiers surrendered to the Japanese after running out of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. The surrender itself was a disaster, but what came next was even worse. The Japanese forced the captured soldiers to march over 65 miles through the scorching jungle heat with little food or water. Thousands died along the way. Some were shot or bayoneted just for falling behind. Others were beaten to death for attempting to get a sip of water from nearby streams. Many who made it to the prison camps were so weak they would die within weeks. Inside Japanese POW camps, conditions were even more horrifying. Prisoners were forced to work in coal mines, shipyards, and factories under brutal conditions. Food was almost non-existent, with many surviving on just a handful of rice per day. Beatings, torture, and executions were common. One of the most notorious camps was Camp Omori in Japan, where captured American pilots, including Lieutenant Louis Zamperini, later famous from the book and movie Unbroken, were subjected to daily beatings. Some prisoners were used for medical experiments, starved, infected with diseases, or subjected to chemical tests. Others were simply executed at random, escape stories and survival tactics. Behind enemy lines, despite the extreme dangers, some POWs attempted daring escapes, though few succeeded. In the Pacific, prisoners who managed to break free had to survive in unfamiliar jungles, evading both Japanese soldiers and the harsh natural environment. One remarkable story is that of Captain William Dias, who, along with several others, managed to escape a Japanese prison camp in the Philippines, survive in the jungle, and eventually link up with Filipino resistance fighters before being rescued by a U.S. submarine. For those who couldn't escape, survival became a mental battle, just as much as a physical one. Many prisoners developed small acts of defiance to maintain their dignity, secretly sabotaging enemy work, stealing extra food, or simply refusing to break under interrogation. Some found strength in camaraderie, forming deep bonds with fellow prisoners that kept them going even in the darkest moments. Liberation and the aftermath. The war came to a close. Both German and Japanese POW camps were liberated, but for many prisoners, the suffering did not end when they were freed. Many were so weak from starvation that they could barely walk. Others suffered from long-term physical and psychological trauma, haunted by what they had endured. For those who had survived Japanese captivity, the psychological scars were even deeper. Many former POWs suffered from severe PTSD, nightmares, and lasting physical ailments caused by starvation and disease. Some struggled to talk about what had happened to them for decades. Despite the horrors they faced, the stories of American POWs in World War II are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Whether enduring the brutal marches of Bataan, surviving the harsh winters of Germany, or making daring escapes behind enemy lines, these soldiers displayed incredible courage in the face of unimaginable suffering. Their experiences remain some of the most harrowing and inspiring stories of the war, stories that deserve to be remembered and honored. The untold contributions of American women in WWII, while World War II is often remembered as a war fought by men, women played a critical role on and off the battlefield. Whether as nurses saving lives under fire, pilots ferrying aircraft across dangerous skies, or spies gathering intelligence behind enemy lines, women proved their courage, skill, and resilience in every theater of the war. Many risked their lives. Some made the ultimate sacrifice, and yet their stories are often overlooked. WWII, Waves, and the women who kept the military running. When the U.S. entered the war, thousands of women volunteered to serve in the military, in roles that before the war had been strictly reserved for men. To meet the growing demand for personnel, the military established women's auxiliary forces, allowing women to officially enlist. WWII, Women's Army Corps. These women served in over 200 different jobs, including mechanics, radio operators, cryptographers, and even anti-aircraft gunners. Some were stationed in war zones facing enemy fire as they worked to support frontline operations. WWII, Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. The U.S. Navy's Women's Corps handled critical communications, intelligence work, and administrative duties, allowing male sailors to deploy into combat. WASPs, Women Air Force Service. Pilots. These female pilots ferried planes across the country, towed targets for live ammunition training, and tested newly repaired aircraft, one of the most dangerous jobs in the Air Force. Over 1,000 women served as WASPs, but 38 died in the line of duty. Despite their service, they were not granted military status until decades later. Combat nurses. Healing under fire. While women weren't officially allowed to serve in direct combat roles, military nurses often found themselves on the front lines, treating wounded soldiers under fire. One of the most heroic stories is that of Army nurse Lauren Aleda Lutz, who flew over 190 evacuation missions, rescuing wounded soldiers from battlefields in North Africa and Italy. Tragically, she was killed when her evacuation plane crashed in 1944, becoming one of the first American women to die in combat. In the Pacific, Navy nurse Dorothy Still and her colleagues were captured by the Japanese and held as prisoners for over 3 years in the Philippines. Despite being severely malnourished and forced into grueling conditions, they continued treating sick and wounded prisoners. These nurses became known as the Angels of Bataan, and their bravery saved countless lives. Women in the resistance, spies, saboteurs, and freedom fighters. Beyond serving in official military roles, many women risked their lives as spies and resistance fighters working behind enemy lines to sabotage Axis forces, smuggle weapons, and rescue downed pilots. One of the most extraordinary stories is that of Virginia Hall, an American woman who worked for the British Special Operations Executive (SOE) and the U.S. Office of Strategic Services (OSS). Despite having a prosthetic leg, Hall parachuted into Nazi-occupied France, trained resistance fighters, and helped organize sabotage missions against German forces. She was so effective that the Gestapo called her the most dangerous Allied spy. Another remarkable figure was Claire Phillips, an American spy in the Philippines who posed as a nightclub singer while secretly passing intelligence to guerrilla fighters. She smuggled supplies to American POWs and relayed critical information about Japanese troop movements. Eventually, she was caught, imprisoned, and tortured, but she never revealed her sources. Women who disguised themselves to fight. While women were officially barred from combat, some disguised themselves as men to fight on the front lines, much like their predecessors in the American Civil War. One such woman was Sergeant Florence Finch, who, though working as a clerk in the Philippines, secretly aided the resistance by smuggling food and supplies to prisoners. When caught by the Japanese, she was imprisoned and tortured but never revealed her secrets. After the war, she was awarded the Medal of Freedom, making her one of the most decorated women of WWII, the legacy of women in WWII. Despite their courage and sacrifice, women's contributions were often dismissed or forgotten after the war. Many were expected to return to traditional roles, even after proving they could serve just as bravely as their male counterparts. It wasn't until decades later that many of these women were properly recognized for their service. From the nurses, who risked their lives to save wounded soldiers, to the spies who outwitted the enemy, to the pilots who pushed the boundaries of aviation, the women of WWII proved that heroism knows no gender. Their stories deserve to be remembered, honored, and shared for generations to come. The aftermath. Life after war. For many American soldiers, returning home from World War II was not the triumphant ending they had imagined. After years of brutal combat, captivity, and sacrifice, millions of veterans returned to a country that had moved on without them. The transition from soldier to civilian was anything but smooth. Many faced physical injuries, psychological trauma, and difficulties finding work or reconnecting with loved ones. At the same time, programs like the GI Bill helped transform the lives of many veterans, providing them with education, housing, and opportunities they never would have had otherwise. Yet, some heroes of the war faded into history, their stories forgotten in the rush to rebuild a post-war world. The struggles of reintegration. Coming home was supposed to be a time of celebration, but for many veterans, it was a period of confusion and struggle. Post-traumatic stress and psychological trauma. The horrors of war did not simply vanish when soldiers stepped off the ship and onto American soil. Many returning troops suffered from what was then called battle fatigue, now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Nightmares, anxiety, and sudden outbursts were common, yet few soldiers received the help they needed. Mental health was rarely discussed, and many veterans were expected to simply move on without acknowledging the emotional toll of what they had experienced. Physical injuries and disabilities. Thousands of soldiers returned with life-altering injuries, missing limbs, severe burns, and other wounds that required long-term medical care. The government provided some support through veterans' hospitals, But medical treatment was often inadequate, and prosthetics were rudimentary compared to modern standards. Many disabled veterans struggled to find jobs, as employers were hesitant to hire them due to their physical limitations. Job shortages and a changing economy. While the U.S. experienced an economic boom after the war, millions of returning veterans found it difficult to secure employment. Factories that had been producing war materials no longer needed as many workers, and businesses were already staffed by civilians who had taken over while the soldiers were away. The transition was particularly hard for those who had enlisted right out of high school. Many had never held civilian jobs and had no formal education beyond basic military training. Family and relationship struggles. Some veterans came home to find that their families had changed in ways they never expected. Wives who had worked during the war had become more independent. Children had grown up without them. And in some cases, marriages fell apart due to the long separation and emotional distance created by war. Many soldiers felt like strangers in their own homes, struggling to reconnect with loved ones who could never fully understand what they had been through. How the GI Bill changed the lives of veterans. Despite the hardships, one of the most significant programs to help returning soldiers was the GI Bill, officially known as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. This groundbreaking legislation provided veterans with tuition for higher education. Over 2.2 million veterans attended college or vocational school thanks to the GI Bill, creating an educated workforce that fueled America's post-war economic growth. Low-interest home loans. Millions of veterans were able to buy homes and start families, leading to the rise of suburban America. Unemployment benefits. For those struggling to find work, the GI Bill provided a year of unemployment assistance, helping veterans stay on their feet while searching for jobs. For many, this program completely transformed their futures. Soldiers who had grown up in poverty now had the opportunity to attend college, start businesses, and achieve financial stability. The GI Bill helped create the American middle class, shaping the economy for decades to come. However, not all veterans benefited equally. African American soldiers, despite serving bravely in the war, often faced discrimination when trying to use their GI Bill benefits. Many were denied entry to colleges due to segregation laws, and banks frequently refused to give them home loans. As a result, while white veterans were able to build wealth and stability, many Black veterans continued to struggle economically, unsung heroes who faded into history. While some veterans became celebrated war heroes, many simply faded into history, their sacrifices forgotten. The everyday soldiers. Not every veteran returned to parades and medals. For every famous general or war hero, there were thousands of ordinary soldiers who had fought just as bravely, but were never recognized. Some had saved lives on the battlefield, others had survived POW camps, yet when they came home, their stories were lost in time. Women veterans and their fight for recognition. Many women who had served in the WWII, waves, or as combat nurses received little recognition for their efforts. Unlike male veterans, they did not receive the same job opportunities, and most were expected to return to traditional roles as homemakers. It wasn't until decades later that the contributions of women in WWII were fully acknowledged. Minority. Soldiers who were overlooked. African American, Native American, and Japanese American veterans often faced racism and discrimination, even after putting their lives on the line for their country. The Tuskegee Airmen, the Navajo Code Talkers, and the 442nd Infantry Regiment, a Japanese American unit that became the most decorated in U.S. history, all had to fight for decades to receive the recognition they deserved. The lasting impact of WWII on veterans. For many veterans, World War II never truly ended. The memories of battle, the friends lost, and the struggles of returning home stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Some became outspoken advocates for veterans' rights, pushing for better healthcare and support. Others withdrew, unable to fully process what they had endured. Many carried their experiences silently, never speaking of the war even to their closest family members. While WWII veterans are often remembered as the greatest generation, their experiences were far from uniform. Some thrived with the opportunities provided by the GI Bill, while others spent their post-war years struggling with trauma, poverty, or the weight of being forgotten by history. Their stories of sacrifice, resilience, and the fight to rebuild deserve to be told. Whether they were famous heroes or unsung soldiers, every veteran of WW II played a role in shaping the world we live in today. The stories of World War II are vast, but many of the most shocking, inspiring, and heartbreaking tales remain largely unknown. While history books focus on the major battles, D-Day, Pearl Harbor, the Battle of the Bulge, it is the untold experiences of individual soldiers, nurses, spies, and prisoners of war that reveal the true cost of the conflict. Throughout this video, we've uncovered the harsh realities of war, from the brutal conditions on the front lines to the unseen psychological wounds that many veterans carried for life. The incredible ingenuity of forgotten heroes such as the Ghost Army, who waged war without firing a single bullet, and the Navajo Code Talkers, who helped secure victory in the Pacific. The bravery of those overlooked by history, from African American and Native American soldiers to the women who defied expectations by serving in combat zones, saving lives, and fighting as part of the resistance. The unimaginable suffering and resilience of prisoners of war who endured starvation, torture, and the horrors of captivity, but never lost their will to survive. The struggles of returning veterans who came home to a country that didn't always recognize their sacrifices, yet still helped shape the post-war world through the GI Bill and their own determination. These soldiers changed history, but many were forgotten. Their names may not appear in textbooks, but their sacrifices built the world we live in today. A call to remember and share history is more than just dates and battles. It is the stories of people, the ones who fought, endured, and persevered. Many families have relatives who served in World War II, yet their stories often go untold. This is why it's important to preserve these memories. If you have family members who lived through the war, take the time to listen to their stories, document them, and share them. Even the smallest personal accounts help keep history alive. If any of the stories in this video inspired you, share this video with others, because history should not be forgotten. The sacrifices of these soldiers, nurses, spies, and resistance fighters deserve to be remembered for generations to come. Let's keep their legacy alive.